David Brainerd, for me, is one of those guys that, as I have read about his life and read his journals, he's one of those guys that exposes my own shortcomings. You ever have someone like that? You almost are like, man, I'm inspired, but I'm also like, to see how much I have to grow. And that's what David Brainerd is for me. And so, as I was preparing this talk, like, there were so many challenging things that I felt like I could talk about that we could learn from David Brainerd. And I was like, I need to be careful because these are challenges for myself. And so before I even jump into this, I don't want anyone to think, wow, Kevin's like teaching us all this stuff because he thinks he has it all together. And I surely don't. I have so much to grow in. And this is just as much a sermon talk for myself as it is for you guys. So I just want to invite you guys to be inspired with me from David Brainerd's life and from the Bible, and be challenged by him and challenged by the Word of God. And so this is something we're all growing in. So I just want to preface with that. And I want to start out just sharing a little bit about the life of David Brainerd. And that'll be about half of the talk. So sit back, relax, enjoy a story of a man who lived in the 1700s. And I think it's very relevant to our lives today. So David Brainerd was born in Connecticut, New England in the colonial days. If you guys are familiar with George Whitefield or Jonathan Edwards, they were teenagers when David Brainerd was born. Sadly, David Brainerd died before them. And so he lived in colonial America. He lost his dad tragically when he was 9 years old. And to make things even worse, a few years later, his mom passed away, and by the age of about 14, about a month before his 14th birthday, David Brainerd became an orphan. No real parents to raise him after that time. And as you can imagine, that shook him up a bit. And he became somewhat indifferent towards the things of God, even though he was raised somewhat religious, and there were times in his life where he was aware of his sin and aware of his need for God. But after his mom passed away, it really shook him up. And I'm guessing that he was somewhat bitter towards God, and maybe thought that God wasn't really there to help him. But his mind would certainly change. So fast forward to when he was about 20 years old, so maybe around the age of some of you guys, he became very frustrated because he was awakened to the fact that he was sinful. And he was realizing that God was real, and he was reading the Bible, and he hated it. He hated much of the Bible. He was so frustrated with the divine law of God. And he realized he could not match up. And even if he could do the outward things, certainly he could not control his own heart. You guys ever think about that? The things like jealousy, it's a sin. Things like lust and even hatred and even loving anything above God is considered sin. And he saw these things and he thought, why would a God put such a heavy burden on me that I cannot bear? Maybe some of you guys have thought that. But to make things worse in his own mind, he hated the fact that the Bible taught that Jesus was the only way to God. He wished there was some other way that he could be saved other than through faith in Jesus Christ. Why was this so frustrating to him? Because he didn't have faith in Jesus Christ at that time. So he was frustrated, and he was also concerned, and he went through many different phases of confusion and frustration. Some atheism, as he says, his heart was full of atheism. It's kind of a weird way of saying it, but that's kind of how he said it. And he was mad at God for being sovereign and being in control over his salvation. And something supernatural happened in July of 1739, 1 year later after thinking about God and wrestling through this, something supernatural happened. And he doesn't explain exactly what it was, except for God revealed himself to him. Something happened in his heart. And he said it wasn't a vision of anything. He wasn't taken up into heaven or anything ridiculous like that. But rather, God somehow revealed himself to him. And his desires suddenly changed. Rather than being angry towards God, he loved God. And he loved the plan of salvation that God had for him. And he loved that he was saved by grace through faith. And all of a sudden, he had this strong desire to be with God, to love him, to glorify him, and to use his entire life to serve him. What the heck happened? It's nothing less than being born again. Conversion. Something supernatural happened in his life in that year of 1739 at 21 years old. So you might think that's a little late to start college. Maybe some of you guys think that's a little young to start college. I'm still trying to get my master's degree slowly. I'm 30. So at 21 years old, he decided, God, I'm going to serve you. I'm going to become a pastor. So I'm going to go to Yale University. And so he enrolls, and this was the start of an illness that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As he would study and toil, learn, he would get super sick. And multiple times he was sent home for the semester, or sent home at least for long periods of time. And so obviously this really slows down his schooling. He's needing to go home and recover. He was coughing up blood. At that time they called it consumption. They didn't really know what it was. Now we can look back and we know that that it was tuberculosis that he had. But people at his school thought that it was due to him studying too hard. But it was likely not because of that. But he had tuberculosis. And this illness continued to haunt him. One time when he came back from school after being sick, Jonathan Edwards came and spoke. Actually, it was Whitefield, George Whitefield. He was a famous preacher, had come and spoken at the school while he was back home. And he came back, and the students, many of them were on fire for God. Something happened at that university, and students became passionate for following Jesus. Lives were changing. But here's the thing. The students were really on fire for God, but the staff, it was a Christian school, the staff weren't quite as enthusiastic. And so there would be like prayer meetings and stuff like that would happen. You can go to the next slide. It has to do with the Great Awakening. So Great Awakening was a movement that was happening throughout America. It was sweeping across America. And students, young people, and old people were coming to Christ and being awakened in their faith. And so one day, David Brainerd got together with some of his friends, and they were praying, and a professor came to join them. His name was Mr. Whittlesey. And Mr. Whittlesey comes in, and he prays with them. And he probably wasn't quite as enthusiastic. Maybe he prayed a dull prayer. I don't know what happened. But he left that meeting, and two of David Brainerd's friends, so it was David Brainerd, two other guys, one of them asked David, hey, what do you think about Mr. Whittlesey and his prayer? And David Brainerd made the comment, he has no more grace than a chair. I don't really know what that means totally, but it wasn't a good thing. It's something along the lines of, I think his prayer was lame. And so, was that a good comment or not? Probably not. Probably not. Maybe he did pray a lame prayer. I don't know. But it was an arrogant comment for him to make. Now, you might think, well, what's the big deal? Well, earlier that semester, there had been a rule that was passed because students were feeling like their professors weren't as enthusiastic about religion. They were making comments about their professors. And so the school passed a rule saying you can't do that anymore. You cannot say anything like that about your professors. And someone overheard David Brainerd say that comment. And that person told someone else, and eventually it got to the authorities. And that was the primary reason that he was expelled from Yale University. So you might be like, wow, that's crazy. So it was that. There was one other comment he was accused of, and he had also snuck out to go to a prayer meeting when he wasn't supposed to. He was a bad boy. Anyway, so he was expelled, and he did feel extreme conviction for this after the fact. And he tried to reconcile with the university. He apologized. He felt that he had sinned against God and sinned against this professor by hurting him, by making that comment. He knew it was an arrogant thing to say. But it took years before they would finally let him back into school. And at that time, he felt God had called him something else. And they denied him his degree time and time again. And in God's divine sovereignty, in God's knowledge of the future, God knew that he would need to be doing something else other than being at Yale University. So what might have seemed like a tragedy or seemed like a great loss for David Brainerd, God ended up using for good. I think that's a great lesson for us. So his dreams of becoming a pastor were crushed at that time. Because at that time, you pretty much needed a college degree if you were going to be a pastor and get a job as a pastor. So that dream was crushed. And so one of his friends said, hey, have you ever thought about becoming a missionary to the Native Americans? And he said, I'll think about it. He prayed about it. And he felt like God said, David, this is what you need to do. And so he signed up, and he was examined and licensed to preach July 29th, 1742. And he became a missionary to the Indians, where he would spend the rest of his life. For a long time, he had little evidence of success. And he was alone. He didn't have a team. There's a reason that we send people out in teams. He didn't have a team. He was by himself. The way that missionaries would do it back then was they would stay usually with a host family outside of a Native American village. And then they would travel into that village every day, and they would work there, they would preach, they would teach, and then they'd come back in the evening and sleep in their nice, cozy bed at their host family's home. Well, he felt like he was not being as effective by traveling back and forth. He thought it would be more effective if he actually lived there. So in multiple villages that he worked at, he would build a home for himself, a little hut for himself, and he would live there out oftentimes in the freezing cold weather. And remember, he still had tuberculosis. So he's coughing up blood throughout his ministry. Sometimes it was so cold, it was freezing outside. He'd go into his little hut, he'd build a fire, and it would fill up with smoke in his hut to the point where he would be suffocating. And then he'd go outside to get some relief, and he'd be in the freezing cold again, and the cycle would continue. So you can imagine the sacrifice that he is making to be here. And, he could have just lived with his host family, but he wanted to be effective, and I commend him for that. He says that he struggled with the languages, with learning the Native American languages. But here's the thing. He learned multiple languages fluently, and he would learn them within a year. And to me, that sounds like a huge success. But to him, it was a struggle. He considered it a struggle. And you can imagine why. Imagine if you were in a place where there was no one else to speak English to. Not one other person to have a conversation with, unless you learn the language. That would feel like a struggle if it took you a year to learn a language. But to us, we're like, man, you're fluent in a language in a year? That's amazing. Okay, so I guess it's just context. He did have success with one Indian village, with one tribe called the Susquehanna Indians, and amazing things happened there as he labored there for them, as he prayed for them, as he preached to them. People were coming to Christ, repenting of their sin, seeing their need for Jesus. And people were relocating their homes to come and live next to him so that they could hear him preach there. Now, At the end of his ministry, there was only about 150 people that he could, with a lot of certainty, say, I think these people came to faith in Jesus genuinely. So it's not a ton, but those 150 people matter. And that's for eternity that we're talking about. And if he spent all of his life laboring for the gospel and only one person came to the knowledge of salvation through Jesus Christ and spent eternity with God in heaven, that would have been worth it. That would have been worth it all. But the reality is, David Brainerd's legacy and story has impacted probably thousands and thousands of people, hundreds of thousands maybe, as they've read his story and been inspired by his character. His illness got worse and worse to the point where, if I remember right, there were times when he was riding his horse half conscious, trying to continue the ministry. And when he finally got so sick that he could not go any further, he lived with the Edwards family, Jonathan Edwards and his family, as he was dying, and they took care of him. And Jonathan Edwards, as he writes about his time with David Brainerd, expresses such joy for being able to spend that time with David Brainerd and hear the words of encouragement that he spoke. And Jonathan Edwards spoke so highly of him. And he wouldn't trade that time for anything. But do you know what ended up happening was Jonathan Edwards' daughter, 17 years old, ended up catching tuberculosis and dying 4 months later. And Edwards would still say that time with David Brainerd was precious, and he did not resent it one bit. And October 9th, 1747, 29 years old, David Brainerd breathed his last breath. And I am so encouraged by the way he went out hard, because he never, ever gave up. I want to read just one quote for you of something he said during some of the last days of his life. He says, "Now in my illness, while I am full of pain and distress from day to day, all the comfort I have is in being able to do some little char or some small piece of work for God." That was his comfort. That was his joy, to know God and to serve him with all of his heart. So why was David Brainerd such an inspiration to so many people? Why did he make such a big impact, not just on the people he ministered to, but on me and on people throughout history, and hopefully on you guys as well? Why did he make such an impact? I think one of the reasons is because he was a modern example of living out the truth from Philippians chapter 1, 21 through 24. And that's on your note sheet there. I think he was a living example of this. And this is the Apostle Paul speaking. He says, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet, what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart." In other words, I desire to die and be with Christ, which is far better. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. I think this was the attitude of his life. With the pain and the toil that he was going through from his illness, I'm sure there were times that he would go, "Man, I would much rather be out of this. But as long as I'm useful to the kingdom of God, I will live hard for Christ. And I will live for the glory of God and for the edification, for the help of others." So here's the key point. If there's one point I could make, it's this. David Brainerd had a crystal clear understanding of our purpose in life, and it led him to an impactful life of meaning, satisfaction, and joy. I think that's an amazing thing as he surrenders his life to God, that is what gave him meaning, impact, purpose, and joy. And so what is our purpose? Some would say, put it simply defined as this: to glorify God by enjoying him forever. To glorify God by enjoying him forever. I think it's the next slide. There we go. It's on your note sheet too. There's 3 examples that I think we can follow from David Brainerd's life. This was really hard for me to choose because there were so many things that inspired me as examples to follow. But I wanted to pick just 3 of them for the sake of time that I think we can all learn from, and I think that will be really helpful to all of us. The first is his hope in heaven. His hope in heaven. That is where his hope was located. He was living for it. And as I read through his journals, the verse Psalm 73, 25 through 26 seemed to be everywhere in it. Not necessarily quoted, but the spirit of this verse was all over in his journals. And this verse, Psalm 73, 25 through 26, it says, "Whom have I in heaven but you? And there's nothing I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." Whom have I in heaven but you? There's only one thing that's going to last forever. Well, maybe a couple things, but our soul is one of those things. There's so many things we cannot take out of this world when we pass away. And David Brainerd knew that crystal clear. He also knew that his body was failing. But here's the reality. I think sometimes in our youth, in our health, we forget that each one of us has an expiration date. That our bodies are all dying. Our flesh and our heart are failing. But there is something that will last forever, and that is our soul. And David Brainerd had a crystal clear understanding of that. There are 2 ways that I really saw that he put his hope in heaven. So you might be asking, well, how, Kevin, do I put my hope in heaven? And there are two things that I see. The first is that he loved to be with God. He loved to be alone praying. And he would spend oftentimes hours, even full days, taking time off from his ministry and work to spend praying to God and to spend asking God for help and assistance, because he knew that ultimately everything he did relied on God. God is the one who sustains everyone's life. He's the one that makes things work. And there's a verse that I decided I'd memorize today, and I don't know if I have it, but it's I think it's Psalm 127, verse 1. It says, "Unless the Lord builds the house, the workers labor in vain." Did I have that reference right? Yeah. So, unless God does the work, we work in vain. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't work. We still need to go work. But unless God is in it, our work is in vain. And David Brainerd knew this, and so he loved to get away with God. Here's one quote that he says. He says, "Oh, 1 hour with God infinitely exceeds all the pleasure and delights of this lower world." Think about that. I think it's true. Maybe some of you guys haven't experienced that yet, but it's available to you. 1 hour with God infinitely exceeds all the pleasures and delights of this world. Think about all the pleasure you could possibly have. God is better, and he's making himself available to us. And David Brainerd knew that, and he experienced that, and he loved being with God. The second way I see him putting his hope in heaven was he loved to serve the Lord. He loved it. He loved to see other people come to know Jesus. And he loved spending his life doing that. He felt like that was the most satisfying thing he could possibly do. Here's another quote from him. He says, "There is nothing in the world worth living for, but doing good and finishing God's work." There's nothing in the world worth living for, but doing good and finishing God's work. And these types of statements were just all throughout his journal. Oftentimes he said the same type of thing over and over and over again, so I'll spare you reading all of them, but you get the point. So I think I'm going to make some speculations about what helped him have this desire for heaven. What helped him cultivate this desire for heaven? And so if you're going, hey, I want to desire heaven, but I don't. I want to live for heaven, but I don't. Here's some things that I think might be helpful. First thing is he knew the Bible well, and he believed it. He knew the Bible well, and he believed it. So verses like Psalm 73, 25 through 26 that I just mentioned, he likely knew that well. Secondly, he fought to direct his heart. That's one thing I saw through his journals over and over and over again, that he was seeing where his heart was off a little bit, and then he would try and correct it. And he would ask God for help. And, sometimes I think we don't really care about what's going on in our heart, as long as our outward actions look okay. And this is something that David Brainerd really focused his life doing, was searching his heart and making sure that his desires were pointed towards the right things. Proverbs 4:23 says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Jealousy, when that would pop up in his heart, he'd redirect that. Envy, lust, discontentment, desire for the things of the world. When things like that would come up in his heart, he would work to redirect that. And that's something that I need to be working on. But I think one of the other big things is that he had tasted the goodness of God. And here's the thing, if we don't know how good God is, none of this is going to make sense to us. We've got to know the goodness of God. Psalm 34:8 says, oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. And if you haven't done it before, I encourage you, spend an hour with God. Spend 3 hours with God. Seek him and you will find him. That's something that he promises. So whether you're here and you've been going to church your whole life, or whether you're here and you say, Kevin, I don't even believe in Jesus. I don't believe in God. Spend time with God. Seek him. And when you get to that place where you're tasting and seeing that God is good, when you're praying to him, spending time with him, don't leave right away. So often I think we leave after 10 minutes because we get bored and we don't see anything happen. But if we would seek him, God promises that you will find him. Taste and see that he is good. Cultivate his desire for living for heaven was his affliction, his suffering, in other words. I think in a way it brought him to the end of himself, to where he had no way to live for this world. He was a dying man and he knew it. He was a sick man and he was in pain and he knew it, and there was probably going to be no relief, like we might have hopes of if we had modern medical care. And so I think that it was actually in a way a gift to him, because it allowed him to go, I don't have anything else to live for. I surrender, God, because there's nothing else in this world that's going to give me real satisfaction. And by turning that into God, I think that he got God more, because all of his hope was in him. And so if you're going through affliction, be assured that God can use it for good. And he can use it to give you even more joy and more satisfaction than you've ever had in your life. So press into that. There's hope. I want to read a poem. I don't know if I've ever read a poem at Challenge before, but I think this is a poem that he wrote because it was in his journal, and I searched online and I couldn't find it by anyone except for him. So this is it. And it's in older English, so bear with me. He says, farewell, vain world. So he's speaking to the world. He's personifying the world. Farewell, vain world. My soul can bid adieu. My Savior's taught me to abandon you. Your charms may gratify a sensual mind, not please a soul wholly for God designed. Forbear to entice, cease then my soul to call. 'Tis fixed through grace, my God shall be my all. While he thus lets me heavenly glories view, your beauties fade, my heart's no room for you. Once again, he's personifying the world. He's saying the things of the world, the things that this earth has to offer is no good compared to my God. All right, number 2. His hatred for sin, I think, is an example that we can follow. His hatred for sin. He had a really similar mindset about himself that the Apostle Paul did when Paul said things like, Christ Jesus came to save the world, to save sinners of whom I am the worst. So the Apostle Paul, who God used to speak through him to write the scriptures, said, I'm the worst of all sinners. And I think he saw his sin very clearly. And so David Brainerd did as well. Or Paul also says in Romans 7:24-25, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ, my Lord. Paul knew he was a sinful man, a wretched man, and so did David Brainerd. But David Brainerd also said things like, all I want is to be more holy, more like my dear Lord. I don't hear people talk like that much these days. But this is how Paul talked, and this is how David Brainerd talked. And, I hear a lot of times people will say, hey, well, I'm a good person. And I think we're just comparing ourselves to other sinners in the world. And, I do this. I think we all do this to sometimes try and make ourselves feel better about ourselves. But the reality is, Jesus Christ died for us. The perfect God died for us so that we don't have to try and justify ourselves and say, well, I'm a good person. When the reality is our hearts are not okay. They're not pure. And that's good news for us to be able to go. But there's a way to take care of that. God's provided a way to fix that. And I think David Brainerd knew that. And so it freed him up to hate his sin for what it was and to strive for holiness. There's a famous verse in the Bible. Maybe some of you guys have heard about it. It's on coffee cups sometimes, or sometimes friends say it to another friend to encourage them through a hard time. It's Romans 8:28, and it says, "For we know that God works all things for our good." Someone help me with this verse. John, help me out.
For those who love God, all things work together for good to those who are called according to His purpose.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. So people will say this to each other. Oh man, Mark, you're having a bad day, dude. God works all things, for good, brother. Yeah. And I think that's good, and I think David Brainerd loved that verse, but he also loved the second half, which is in verse 29. That says, "For those God foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, Jesus." The reason that God can say everything is working out for good, even in the midst of being deathly sick, is because that ultimate good is becoming more like Jesus, becoming more godly, more like God. And that was what David Brainerd took his joy in. That was his life goal, to be more like Jesus. And he would say, oh man, I long to be more like my Lord, more like Jesus, for sanctification, which just means becoming more like Jesus. And I think if we're honest, I'm speaking for myself here a lot of times. This isn't me pointing out just in you guys. This is us. I think if we're honest, we don't always, or oftentimes, don't really care about our holiness. We want to make sure we're saved, right? We care about that. We want God. If He's really all-powerful, we want to be on His good side. But we also kind of want our sin as well. And I think sometimes we hate getting caught for our sin, more than we actually hate our sin itself. And you might be saying, well, Kevin, that's not true. I hate my sin. I don't like it. I know I need to grow. Well, let me ask you this. The last time you got a traffic ticket, speeding ticket, were you more upset about the fact that you got the ticket or the fact that you had broken the law in which God tells you to be subject to because we live in this country and we're to submit ourselves to authorities? I don't think any of you guys were more broken. I wasn't last time I got a ticket. I don't want tickets anymore, but we need to be more broken about our sin than we are about the consequences for it. And I see that in David Brainerd's life. I really see that in his life. And that's something that I want to pursue. There's a quote from a book that I've been reading. Some of you guys have been reading it recently. It's called Humility. And here's a quote from the author. He says, "Those who know true joy in the midst of sufferings are those who recognize that in this life our suffering is never as great or as serious as our sins. Our biggest problem is not our affliction that we're going through. It's not the class you can't pass. It's not the person who did wrong to you. It's not the illness that you have. Your greatest problem is your own sin. And that's true for me as well. And Jesus Christ made a remedy for that by dying for us on the cross and paying for our sins. And now he's called us to freedom. He's called us to holiness. He's called us to live for him and to put that sin to death because we are no longer slaves to it. We no longer need to sin like we felt like we did at one time. The third example to follow, his true conversion. His true conversion. And I wasn't sure how to put this in, but I think it's so important. And I think that maybe for many of us, we actually need to go back and go, I need to make sure that I'm right with God. And that I understand what true conversion is. As David Brainerd talks about his story of coming to God, he says prior to it, he says this, "My wicked heart often wished for some other means of salvation than by Jesus Christ." It's like, I wish there was another way. Why does it have to be Jesus? And I think we hear that all over the world right now. And, you know, you hear people say, well, can't you just have a different religion? And David Brainerd hated the fact that it was only through Jesus Christ. But he also knew that his hopes didn't change the reality of the situation. That God created the world, created him, and he came down to die for him in the form of Jesus Christ. I mentioned this earlier, but there were two things that he really hated about God's ways. He hated the strictness of God's law, and that he could not do it. And he hated the fact that faith alone was the condition for salvation. He hated that because he did not have faith in Jesus. He hated verses like Mark 16:16 that says, "But whoever does not believe will be condemned." Gosh, he didn't like that, and I understand why. He hated Ephesians 2 verse 1 and 2 verse 8. That says, "As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins." He knew he was dead. He didn't like it. And he hated verse 8 that says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves. It is a gift of God." He wanted to be able to somehow earn his own salvation, to earn his way to heaven. Maybe for some of you guys, you've been thinking, man, if I just live a good enough life, I'm going to get there somehow. God will let me in. If I just live good enough. Maybe if I'm just religious enough. Maybe if I just pray. Maybe if I just go to church and I call myself a Christian. Maybe I'll get in somehow. But that's not the case. It's by God's grace that you've been saved through faith, not from yourselves, not from your works. And maybe some of you guys are on the other side and you're going, I hate the fact that it's by faith. I hate that I have to have faith. And I think sometimes, even in our Christian culture, we can err a little bit and we can say, hey, as long as somehow you have some type of faith in Jesus, you're golden, you're going to heaven. So if you say, yeah, I believe in Jesus, then that's it. You're in. And David Brainerd knew that real faith was going to produce a heart change in him. That real faith was going to produce obedience in him to God. And so he knew when he didn't have that faith, and he knew when God had done a work in his heart, and when he had faith in God. And it changed his life. It changed his desires. And that can be your story. And so I want to give you guys some applications that I think David Brainerd would say if he were here. If he could stand here, if he could come down from heaven and say, challenge. I want to give you some exhortations. I want to encourage you guys. I want to plead with you guys. Here's what I think he would say. I think he would say, look to Jesus. Put all your hope in him. He alone can save you. Don't stop seeking him until you find him. Don't give up. Don't go back to business as usual. Don't go back to life. Don't keep going through college, being busy, waiting to seek Jesus. Seek him with all your heart. I think he would say, commit yourself to him, because in the end, he's the only thing worth living for. So give it all, like an investment that you for sure will be able to cash in on, that there will for sure be a return on. Guaranteed. Live your life spent for God. I think he would remind us that God is all good. He's all powerful. And that when you place your life completely in his hands, you will never be ripped off. It will always be worth it. And I think he would remind us that this world will pass away. So don't be consumed by it. My friends, there is so much hope for us. And I think David Brainerd would just remind us, don't get caught up in the little things that are going to steal our time, steal our passion. Put your hope in God. He's our Savior. He's our King. It will be worth it. So, let me pray for us. God, I ask you that you would manifest your presence in each one of our lives, that your influence would be tangible in each one of our lives. God, I pray right now for those who have come here, who have maybe been walking with you for a while, that you would raise them up to live lives of holiness, to commit their lives fully to you. And would you use them to do incredible things for your kingdom, even in their hearts, just praising you and glorifying you. God, I pray for those who've come here tonight and they're seeking, wondering what's true. They're wondering, what is all this about? I pray that you would work in their lives. Bring them to experience your goodness in a powerful way, and to see that you desire to save. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it was helpful for you and for growing in your relationship with God. If you are a college student in between the ages of 18 and 26, we want to invite you to join us on campus for our weekly meeting. If you want to see more videos like this about how to grow in your relationship with God, go ahead and click this video icon up here and it'll take you to a link to another video. Also, I want to remind you not to forget to subscribe to the Challenge channel by clicking on the Challenge logo right down here. Thanks, guys.